Hey guys, we are now officially in the month of November, just 7 days away from the midterm elections on the 8th, and we have still very many competitive Senate elections. And so in this video, we'll be taking a look at the latest polls for those races in just the last 3 days, including today, the 1st of November. We've got a whole ton of new polls released from every single competitive race on the map. We don't actually have polling from Florida, but in all of these great states, we have new polls from. And so in this video, we'll be taking a look at what those polls are saying about the country's closest elections, and many of them show pretty conflicting numbers, especially in the most competitive states like Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. Many polls show Democrats ahead, others have Republicans in the lead, and so it'll be key to be able to determine who's actually going to win despite these conflicting numbers. And so we're just going to go down the list here because that's how we're going to cover every single election. So starting off in Arizona, this is a race the Democrats can still win. Mark Kelly has always been a strong incumbent and has always been doing well against Blake Masters. In fact, to this day, Mark Kelly has still led in every single poll for this election. There's never been a single poll out of Arizona that has shown Mark Kelly losing to Blake Masters. And so currently the polling average is 2.9% in favor of Kelly, the worst position he's been in over the entirety of the election cycle. Even though Mark Kelly is a strong incumbent, winning in Arizona is going to be very, very difficult for Democrats. Joe Biden barely carried the state in the 2020 presidential election, winning it by just 0.31%. You go back 4 years, Trump carried Arizona by 3.5%, and in 2012, Romney won the state by almost double digits against Barack Obama. And yes, Democrats have had victories in the state in the past few years, most recently, of course, in 2020, when Mark Kelly won his 2-year term in the special election against Martha McSally by 2.3%, and in 2018, Kyrsten Sinema won the same race by 2.3% against McSally. So when looking at both of these elections, they are both held in very good years for Democrats. 2020 and 2018 were both basically blue wave years. Democrats took back the Senate, of course, in 2020 and won the House with 40 flips in 2018. But this year, 2022, it simply is not going to be the same. Democrats are in a much worse position nationwide, and so it will be very difficult for Mark Kelly to win. But right now, I have Arizona as a tilt Democratic state. If I were to bet on one candidate, it would still be Mark Kelly, but the race could definitely go both ways. Next up, in North Carolina, we have a close election between Ted Budd and Cheri Beasley. In fact, the most recent poll only shows Budd leading by just 1%. However, in the polling average, Ted Budd is up by 3.2% against the former Chief Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. And so when looking at all the polls, it's clear that Budd is going to come out on top, even though there was a very short period of time in which Cheri Beasley was actually ahead in the polling. But the latest Trafalgar Group poll has Budd up by 4. We also see a poll from East Carolina University having Budd up by 6. I think there's a good chance that Budd does win by over 5%, but North Carolina is always a very close state. Just look at the previous Senate elections here. Tom Tillis, 1.7% in 2020. In 2016, Richard Burr, 5.7%. Richard Burr was a pretty strong incumbent. Ted Budd is not. He is not a member of the Senate currently. He is part of the House, but as a non-incumbent, Ted Budd isn't going to do as well as his predecessor did in 2016. So even though Ted Budd is going to win this election, it's not going to be by a likely margin. The margin is probably going to be around 4 to 5%, so very close to being a likely margin, but not quite. So North Carolina is going to be a lean Republican state, but definitely a race the Democrats are not going to win. They've been trying to capture a seat in the Tar Heel state for over a decade now. The last time Democrats won a Senate election in the state was back in 2008 when Kay Hagan was elected, defeating Elizabeth Dole, but that was 14 years ago when Democrats won 59 seats in the Senate, and that year was also the last time Democrats won North Carolina in a presidential election when Barack Obama defeated John McCain by just 0.33%. And now we're going to move on to New Hampshire, where we have a very close election between Maggie Hassan and Dawn Bolduc. For a while, it looked like that Hassan was going to pretty easily win her re-election. She was up by 8 points in the polling at one point in time just a couple of weeks ago, but now her lead has shrunk to just 2.8% against the Republican nominee. Now, this most recent poll is not exactly the best poll. Bolduc does lead by 1%, but the sample is flawed, and so when looking at the overall average, Maggie Hassan is still in a relatively strong position, and she will do better than she did in 2016 when she defeated Kelly Ayotte by a margin of just 0.14%. But at the time, Ayotte was the incumbent, and so Maggie Hassan's victory 6 years ago was very impressive. And with Joe Biden winning the state by 7.4% in 2020, it is unlikely that Republicans are going to flip the state of New Hampshire this year, even though it's going to be a good year overall for the party. And so New Hampshire is going to be a lean Democratic state. Maggie Hassan is barely going to win her re-election. I do think she'll win by a little bit over 1%, but it's not going to be a strong victory by any means, but it will still be a lean state. I think that New Hampshire is going to vote to the left of Arizona this year. However, in Colorado, even though this race could be close, Michael Bennet is doing very well against Joe O'Dea as he attempts to win a third full term. Joe Biden won Colorado by 13.5% in 2020, but Michael Bennet only won his re-election in 2016 by 5.7%. So it is possible that he does worse than he did 6 years ago, but when looking at the latest trends, Michael Bennet is doing very well against his Republican opponent. Michael Bennet leads by 10.1% in the polling and has led by double digits in most of the polls released for this election. Colorado is not going to be a lean state. It will be likely for Democrats. Bennet is going to win by at least 5 points. He's not going to win by a double-digit margin, but all he has to do is win more votes than Joe O'Dea, which he is almost guaranteed to do. In fact, the 538 forecast gives him a 91% chance at winning re-election. And if you're interested in the numbers in Arizona, North Carolina, and New Hampshire, right now New Hampshire is a lean Democratic state for the first time in a very long time. Arizona is also a lean Democratic state. Mark Kelly only has a slight advantage now over Blake Masters, and in North Carolina, it's likely Republican, with Ted Budd having a 4 in 5 chance at winning his first 6-year term. But in the state of Colorado, it's going to be likely Democratic. Republicans have no chance at flipping this state. And now moving on to a race that really isn't as competitive as the ones we've gone over before. This is the election in Missouri between Trudy Busch Valentine and Eric Schmidt. And of course, Eric Schmidt is going to win and succeed Roy Blunt, who will be retiring next year after 2 terms in the Senate. Overall, though, Schmidt is up by 11.4% in the polling average. He might win by a solid margin, but right now it's more likely that he wins by 13 to 15%, which will make Missouri a likely Republican state, but still a race that they're definitely not going to lose despite having a retiring incumbent. The 530 forecast right now gives Republicans an over 99% chance at holding on to the seat. And then we also have some new polls from Utah, the election between incumbent Mike Lee and independent Evan McMullin. McMullin is a conservative independent and also does have the backing of the Utah Democratic Party, who has chosen not to nominate a candidate themselves. And so Mike Lee leads by 8.6% on average, but when looking at some of the polls conducted by McMullin's own super PAC, McMullin actually leads over the incumbent Republican. And so the issue for the GOP here is that Mike Lee is very much in the Trump faction of the Republican Party, which is not popular in the Beehive state. In fact, Mike Lee does not even have the endorsement of Mitt Romney, but in the end, he is still very likely to win re-election. He is not going to win by a solid margin over 15 points, despite winning by 41% in 2016, but he will manage a double-digit margin, so Utah is going to be likely Republican, and definitely much closer than it should be, as Evan McMullin is really giving Mike Lee a run for his money. And then on top of that, we also have a whole ton of new polls from Arizona. I mean, all of these polls show Mark Kelly in the lead, one of them with an even race according to a GOP super PAC, and that's why Mark Kelly right now does still maintain the advantage in this election, but is still going to be very close nonetheless. Arizona is one of the most purple states in the entire country. However, we do have a polling from Ohio as well between J.D. Vance and Tim Ryan, and this election is not going to be nearly as close as the one in Arizona, despite Tim Ryan running a very strong campaign over the last few months. In fact, he led in the polls from December all the way until mid-October. J.D. Vance is still going to come out on top as the Republican in this election. If this race were held in 2018, Tim Ryan would probably win, although by a very small margin. But with the national environment favoring Republicans so heavily, J.D. Vance is going to come out on top simply because he'll have an R next to his name on the ballot. And when looking at the latest polls, yes, some of them do show Tim Ryan leading, but these are from the most liberal pollsters possible. Signal has done a lot of polls for this race, and at one point they did show a very close election between the two candidates, with Vance only ahead by 2% just at the beginning of this month. But now Vance leads by 5, and it's clear that he has the momentum and is on track to winning his first 6-year term and succeeding Rob Portman after 3 terms in the Senate. So Ohio is going to be likely Republican, although just barely. Vance is going to win by around 5 to 7 points. Next up, in New York, Chuck Schumer leads by 12 points against Joe Pinion in the most recent poll. He is not going to win by a solid margin in the end. We saw that in 2018, Gillibrand was reelected by 34 points, and in 2016, Schumer himself was reelected to a 4th term by 43%. But since then, Democrats have done a terrible job in the state of New York. I mean, they've had 3 different lieutenant governors over the course of just less than a year, and also 2 governors after Andrew Cuomo resigned. And so as a result, combined with the fact that 2022 is going to be a red wave year, Chuck Schumer is not positioned as well as he would like to have been. And one of the main reasons why he's doing so poorly is because of how terribly Kathy Hochul is doing in the governor election. She only leads by 6.2% and is actually behind in the most recent poll. So Chuck Schumer is going to do much better than Hochul, but he's still not going to win by a margin over 15%, which will make New York likely Democratic. We also have some polls from Alabama and Oklahoma, but these states aren't going to be too competitive. Republicans are going to win by solid margins in both. Yes, Markwayne Mullin is also going to win by a solid margin against Kendra Hornet. The special election is not going to be that close either, but we do have a surprisingly competitive election in Iowa, where Chuck Grassley is running for re-election to an 8th term against Michael Franken, and he really is struggling to win even by a double-digit margin. In the polling, Grassley only leads by 7.2%. He has been up by double digits according to the 2 most recent Republican-funded polls, but every single independent pollster has Grassley ahead by only a single-digit margin, despite Grassley having been in the Senate for almost 40 years now. Chuck Grassley won by 20% in his last race, 30% in 2010, and 40% in 2004. So his electoral prowess has been weakening as he's been getting older, and so in 2022, he is going to win by the smallest margin since his first election all the way back in 1980. Chuck Grassley is going to win by double digits, but it's not going to be over 15 points. So Iowa is going to be likely Republican, just like Missouri. Next up, in Georgia, Raphael Warnock is struggling to win re-election against Herschel Walker, and this race is going to go to a runoff. There's no way that either Warnock or Walker win in the election on the 8th. They're going to have to win in a second race, as neither of them are going to get anywhere near 50%. We have a third-party candidate, that being Chase Oliver, running as a Libertarian, and he is going to take up a pretty sizable chunk of the electorate. And unless Warnock or Walker win by over 4 or maybe even 5 percentage points in this race in November, none of them are going to win the race outright, and so a runoff in December is what we're going to see here. And what happens in the other races across the country is going to have a major impact on what happens in Georgia, because if Democrats can get to 49 seats without it, and Georgia would be their 50th, there is a good chance that Warnock does win re-election. But if Republicans already win 51 seats and take back the majority without the seat in Georgia, it's unlikely that Democrats are going to have the momentum or energy to come out and vote for Raphael Warnock. And of course, if the GOP does take back both chambers of Congress without needing a runoff in Georgia to give them their 51st seat, Republicans will be more energized and they will come out for Herschel Walker. So the race in Georgia is going to depend on what happens in other places across the country, but with Republicans in a good position to win at least 51 seats just on the 8th of November, I currently have Georgia as a tilt Republican state. I do think that Herschel Walker has the clear advantage right now against Raphael Warnock, even though the election is not going to be decided until December. And then in Nevada, this is the race that's going to give Republicans their 51st seat. It's not going to be Georgia, it might be Arizona, but it's most likely going to be Nevada, where Catherine Cortez Masto is struggling to win re-election. In fact, according to the 538 forecast, Republicans now have the advantage in both Nevada and Georgia, and in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman is barely holding on to his lead. So in the Silver State right now, Catherine Cortez Masto leads by 0.4% in the polling. Polling in Nevada isn't too far off, but Joe Biden was overestimated in the 2020 presidential election, and when you do look at most of the polls released, they do now have Adam Laxalt in a much better position than he was just a couple of weeks ago. And in the governor election, Joe Lombardo is taking a very strong lead against Steve Sisolak. It's unlikely that Democrats win any of the major races this year, even though they've done very well in the state over the last decade. The last time that a Republican won a presidential election in Nevada was George W. Bush back in 2004, and of course in 2018, Democrats flipped the Senate seat currently held by Jackie Rosen. Before, it was held by Dean Heller, and so Jackie Rosen won by 5 points 4 years ago, but Catherine Cortez Masto really isn't that strong of a candidate. There's nothing too exciting about her as a senator, even though she's the first Latina senator in American history. The Latino vote is not coming out for Masto, and early voting numbers in Nevada are looking weak, and the more that people vote, the more Democrats win. Hard turnout does equal better results for Democrats, as there simply are more Democrats, but Republicans are more energized and vote more often. And so looking at everything we're seeing in Nevada right now, it's going to be a tilt Republican state, with Adam Laxalt having an advantage over Catherine Cortez Masto, but even if he wins, it's going to be very tight. In the Keystone State of Pennsylvania, we have new polling suggesting that John Fetterman may not be in as terrible of a position as previously thought, but this poll showing Fetterman up by 5, conducted by Siena College and the New York Times, was conducted over the course of 3 days, with one of those days being after the debate. 2 of them, though, were before the debate actually occurred, and so the debate on the 25th of October is what sank John Fetterman's campaign. His performance was just so terrible because he was still recovering from a stroke, and even though he had a good medical reason to do so, he seemed very weak on the stage, and Pennsylvania is very unlikely to elect John Fetterman to succeed Pat Toomey. Mehmet Oz is now the favorite in Pennsylvania. The margin for Fetterman in the polls has gone down from 5.8% to just 1.1% today, and it's unlikely that Fetterman will increase his margin over the next week. According to the 3 polls that have been released fully after the debate, Mehmet Oz leads by 3%, 2%, and 3%, and with Pennsylvania being a state known to overestimate Democrats, it's unlikely that Oz is going to lose if he is ahead in the latest polling, and so the state of Pennsylvania is going to be lean Republican, with Mehmet Oz having now a clear edge against John Fetterman, who is thought to be a very strong candidate. If Fetterman did not have that stroke, he would be winning this race, but because of that, his medical issues have become a top concern for the election, and it's impacted his race very, very badly. And now we have just 2 races left, one in Wisconsin and one in Washington. So in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is probably going to win by 7 to 8%. He's up by 4 points in the polling. Mandela Barnes doesn't really stand too much of a chance. And out of the 3 elections in Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina, these races are very similar. 538 gives Republicans almost the exact same chance of winning all 3 of them. 79 in North Carolina and Ohio, 80 in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is going to be considerably more solid for the GOP than the other 2. Currently, I have North Carolina only as lean Republican, but barely. But in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is probably going to win by 8 to 9%. The margin in Ohio is going to be 5 to 6. And the main reason for this is that Ron Johnson is the incumbent, and he is somebody that has outperformed polling expectations pretty significantly in his last 2 elections. He was expected to lose in 2016, but still won by 3.4% against Russ Feingold. So Ron Johnson's not going to lose this year. It's red wave year. Mandela Barnes is going to fall short of flipping the Wisconsin Senate seat, a state that Joe Biden barely won in 2020. So winning Wisconsin was always going to be very difficult for the Democratic Party. And finally, in Washington, the latest poll has Patty Murray and Tiffany Smiley in an even race for the Senate seat in Washington. Washington is a state that Democrats have controlled for a very long time, and Patty Murray won by 18 points in 2016 to a 4th term. She is now running for a 5th, and she is a pretty senior member of the United States Senate. And so when looking at the latest data that we have for this election, I'm no longer that confident in Patty Murray's ability to win by a margin larger than 5%. She's still going to win in the end. Tiffany Smiley is not going to flip this seat. Murray already won a majority in the blanket primary, but it's very likely that Tiffany Smiley gets within 5% of the Democratic incumbent. And so with that said, I'm going to tentatively put Washington as a likely Democratic state, but it may be lean in the coming days depending on how this race trends. I think it's definitely possible that Patty Murray does pretty poorly, but she is still going to win, and so whether or not it's lean or likely, it's going to be somewhere around that 5% margin nonetheless. And so with just 1 week to go until the midterms, this is what the Senate map currently looks like. Republicans are definitely favored, but it's not impossible for Democrats to retain their majority. All they have to do is keep their seats in Nevada and Georgia. And the Georgia race, we don't even have to worry about until later. Right now, Democrats' main focus should be to hold onto their seats in New Hampshire, Arizona, and Nevada. If they can do that and get to 49 seats, they will have a very good chance at holding on to the seat in Georgia currently held by Raphael Warnock. But we're definitely seeing increases in support for Republicans across the country, especially in Pennsylvania. The debate is really what blew it for John Fetterman. Without that debate performance, John Fetterman would probably still have a slight advantage, just like Mark Kelly in Arizona. But with that loss, Republicans are in a much stronger position going into these elections. But it's still going to be very, very close. I agree with 538's forecast that says the Senate is a dead heat. Republicans do have a 51% chance at winning according to their forecast. And for the very first time in over 4 months, Republicans are now favored according to their forecast, and I do agree with that. The GOP is now slightly ahead, but their victory is not at all guaranteed. And so that will be it for this video. Make sure you like it down below. If you enjoyed, comment down below which party you think will win the Senate this year. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I will see you guys in the next video.